Okay, let's go into this next story here with Russell Brand. I do want to make sure I touch on this issue here with Ukraine. So Tucker Carlson recently had an interview, and Russell Brand exposed this. I didn't see the Tucker Carlson interview, and unfortunately I can't show some of the Tucker Carlson interviews. I can't show on here because of copyright. Sorry, guys. But so I didn't want to take a chance with this one, but this is through like Russell Brand's thing, so we should be okay. But there is a narrative here in reference to Ukraine that I think the masses is continuing to believe. I think it's starting to change a little bit. And that's the narrative that Ukraine can win. And I think since day one, those of us at RBN have been saying they can't win. They can't beat Russia. And if Russia ever needed some help, they can knock on their next door neighbor's door, which is China, and say, come help us out. So we've been saying for a long time they can't win. Now, this video, these videos with Tucker get millions of views, more views than his segment on Fox News used to get. Now we have a gentleman sitting down with Tucker Carlson admitting that they can't win. Listen to this. Let's dive right in. We start off with Russell getting right into the thick of it.
It's going to be a fantastic show. There's only a few of them. They're all in September. Join me by clicking the link in the description now. The war between Russia and Ukraine shows no sign of ending and indeed is escalating, funded yet still by American taxpayer dollars. Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, had a conversation with Tucker in which he said that Joe Biden's approach and prognosis are deceptive, dishonest, and just plain wrong. That there's no situation in which Ukraine can ever defeat Russia. Now, Viktor Orban is a controversial figure. Many people say he's like right wing and that he's a dictator and all sorts of negative stuff. And I wonder if we're at a point where we have to learn to separate and distinguish between people's cultural analysis of different political figures and the truth about war, particularly a conflict like this one between Russia and Ukraine, which has almost limitless potential to escalate and could literally involve everybody in the world eventually. So let's have a look at that conversation between Tucker and Viktor Orban and note these points. He says the only way to end this conflict is by electing Donald Trump. That's extraordinary when you've got people on the left saying that if Trump ever gets elected, he'll be president for life. He'll never rescind the office. It's the worst thing that could ever happen to America. And note as well that he says that this is ultimately an unwinnable war. Ukraine can never beat Russia. That side of it seems a lot less controversial to me. Let's have a look at the conversation.
The view is that Ukraine is winning this war. It doesn't sound like that's true.
No, it's a lie. It's not just a misunderstanding. It's a lie.
So I do just want to add in here really quick for those who may not have heard this commentary before. But one thing I did mention a couple weeks ago, I did show a clip from CNN where Anderson Cooper actually finally did acknowledge that they were losing. So just FYI.
It's impossible. Everybody who's in politics and understand the logic, the figures, the data, no way.
Why is it impossible?
Because that way, the poor Ukrainians die every day.
Yes.
Hundreds and thousands, you know. So my heart is with them.
An early question to ask yourself is, do you think that propaganda is a one-way street? Or do you imagine that all sides use propaganda to convey the favorable perspective, to bolster a narrative that is favorable to their agenda? The establishment propaganda currently is Ukraine are winning this war. Ultimately, Ukraine will be triumphant. But I feel that those of us that have been alive a little while and been watching the news for a while and have maybe taken a glance at history are aware that Russia are a formidable foe and a nuclear superpower at that. The idea that Russia can be defeated, that there's ever going to be a sort of a white flag moment from Putin is ridiculous. So whatever your perspective is on Viktor Orban, whatever your perspective is on Tucker, whatever your perspective is on Donald Trump, almost you have to look at this conflict in isolation and assess it. What's likely to happen here? Who benefits from this escalating war? Who benefits from us being told, oh, Ukraine will win? And one way of diagnosing this beyond our own personal prejudices and biases is to look at what we were told at the beginning of this conflict and what we are being told now.
Pause there for just a second. I just want to say something else to add in here. The other thing that I was going to add is, and if they can't win, then is the goal mainly to create another never-ending war that you continue to funnel money through? I don't know about you, but I don't want another 20-year Afghanistan. Is that the goal? If they're telling you that they can't win and we're continuing to send them weapons, then we're looking at the possibility of another never-ending war, a prolonged war. That's something to think about.
What were we told at the very start? How long it would last, what it would cost, what the likely outcomes are, and have those things proven to be true?
So it's tragedy. It's tragedy for Ukraine. But they will run out earlier from the soldiers, number of soldiers, than the Russians. What finally will count is boots on the ground. And the Russians are far stronger, far numerous, more numerous
There's more
than
of
Ukrainians.
Many more.
And don't be surprised. Do not be surprised if it's only a matter of time before the Biden administration says, well, Ukraine needs more help and we've been sending them weapons, so we got to send U.S. troops over there to get boots on the ground. That idea has already been discussed. And then you'll see we're entangled in, again, like I said, another Afghanistan. It'll be interesting to see what happens.
It's almost a historical cliche to cite that in the Napoleonic Wars, France were unable to ultimately conquer Russia because there were too many Russians. And in the Second World War, Hitler's armies were unable to conquer Russia because in the end, Stalin would just limitlessly use human resources to prevent Russia being overwhelmed. Is there a vision for what a Ukrainian victory looks like here? Is there a vision for, all right, and then there's the bit where Putin goes, bloody hell, enough's enough, okay, I surrender. There's a clear disjunct between what we're being told and the reality. So whatever propaganda is true from the sort of Russia today, Russian perspective, clearly there's propaganda on behalf of the Biden administration as well. Let's have a look at this in more detail. According to the Washington Post, Viktor Orban is Vladimir Putin's closest ally in the EU. He has refused to allow the transfer of Western weapons across Hungary's shared border with Ukraine and called for an immediate ceasefire and peace talks in the conflict, but without providing a vision of what that would mean for Ukraine's territorial integrity. Ukraine's territorial integrity is obviously important, but is now subject to complex diplomatic negotiations. And Viktor Orban, having already been smeared as a fascist and as a right-wing person and all the various things that you're probably aware of, I think has to be looked at separately from whether or not peace is the desired outcome and whether militarism is going to bring out a favourable solution for anyone. It's interesting to bring to the forefront the question of what a post-war Ukraine looks like, because we know that Zelensky's vision is deals with BlackRock, carve up Ukraine, make it a place that's impossible to unionise, where workers have minimal rights, and financial interests of the West are able to exploit the newly liberated, or at least newly colonized, Ukrainian territory. This is not conspiracy theory stuff. Zelensky's gone on the telly and said, thank you, BlackRock, for all of you. You know, that's when he's in.
But that's if they win, because here's the thing, if they, which we're already saying that they can't win. So when Ukraine loses, BlackRock is already invested apparently, but their economy is going to be in the pits after this, not considering the number of lives that they've lost. And what happens to Crimea? And this is why I question if this is meant to be a prolonged, never-ending war. And I say this because if they can't win, it's not like the US government is just going to say, okay, guys, they're not winning, they're not doing well. You know, we're going to have to talk with NATO to try to like just end this and just settle it. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that would be admitting something to the American people that you should have admitted in the very beginning when you were lying to them and telling the American people that they could win when they couldn't. I think what's going to happen is I think they're going to try to prolong this as much as possible, at least as long as Biden's in office. Prolong it as much as possible, continuing to give them weapons, continuing to give them money and aid. And then I think it's only inevitable it's going to get to a certain point where either we're going to have a change in leadership in the White House, meaning bringing in someone who wants to get this conflict, wants to basically get rid of this conflict and wants to call for peace negotiation. That would also be rather difficult because the powers that be, military industrial complex and corporations, actually want this war to continue. So they may even try to make it so that no one like that will get into the White House during this time. it reminds me of what happened after September 11, right? And I remember, you know, Bush running for a second term. And I remember how close Al Gore came. But we can talk about that another time, maybe on call in, not on here, because I would be careful how to talk about that election. But what I will say is that it was very apparent to me that the powers that be, the military industrial complex and the corporations, really did not want someone else coming in during that time of this issue with Iraq. So that being said, if those powers that be do not allow someone to come into the White House who's going to get us out of this conflict, I do see this continuing to who knows how many years. And if that happens, are the American people going to finally be bold enough to call out the government and to call out the MIC for what it truly is and to call out this war? Or 5 years from now, are people still going to be flying Ukraine flags in their Twitter like bio saying, you can win, you can do it? Let's continue.
In America, that's what they're talking about. So the vision they're presenting is a globalist, corporatist post-war Ukraine. Now, I don't think that the vision for how Ukraine is organized is any of my business, and I'm sure a lot of you share that opinion, in which case, why are American taxpayers paying for this conflict that appears to be leading to a vision that's globalist and corporatist, you could say, certainly on the basis of the BlackRock deal and the basis of Ukrainian workers aren't going to have the right to unionize. Doesn't seem very pro-Ukrainian to me. Let me know what you think in the comments. Fresh from a trip to Kiev, Democrat Senator Richard Blumenthal is arguing that the US is getting its money's worth in Ukraine because Russia is taking losses and no Americans are dying, showing a lack of concern for Ukrainian lives. How many of you thought that when this conflict began, what we're ultimately seeing is the evolution of the American war model, where supporting foreign territories in their conflict against American enemies is preferable to wars where American troops are going to be involved and ultimately killed? Even Americans who have no particular interest in freedom and independence in democracies worldwide should be satisfied that we're getting our money's worth on our Ukraine investment, Blumenthal wrote in the Connecticut Post. That's a pretty cynical way of discussing a conflict which is leading to death and decimation in a country that really doesn't evolve America, except for, I would argue, their economic and imperialist interests. For less than 3% of our nation's military budget, we've enabled Ukraine to degrade Russia's military strength by half, all without a single American servicewoman or man injured or lost, he added. I would say that that's a pretty cynical outlook and reveals plainly what the mentality is. We're fighting a proxy war using Ukrainian lives. It's an investment. We're depleting the resources of our enemy. That's not what we were told at the beginning. We were told that it's a criminal invasion by Putin. We have to defend Ukraine, put a flag in your window, that it was a moral crusade. The argument has become...
That's what we were told. And we've been told these things oftentimes before with other wars. And the thing is, they just want to weaken Russia economically. They do want to implement regime change. They want to overthrow Vladimir Putin. And people have to really grasp that. The sad thing is the majority of Americans have no idea that this is happening. The majority of Americans just know that Russia invaded Ukraine and we got to fight back against big, bad Russia. I've watched the way that Russia has been depicted, whether it's been movies or TV shows, and I've never seen it portrayed in a positive light, not in this country. So it's easy to push that propaganda on the American people when this is all they know, when this is all they know about Russia, right? Most Americans are not going to look further and deeper into this war, although I will say some are starting to push back in reference to the amount of money that's being sent to Ukraine. Maybe that could be the driving force to wake people up.
A common talking point among hawks in Washington who want the US to keep fueling the proxy war against Russia. Senator Mitt Romney recently called the conflict the best national defense spending I think we've ever done. We're losing no lives in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are fighting heroically against Russia, Romney said. We're diminishing and devastating the Russian military for a very small amount of money. A weakened Russia is a good thing. So I suppose at least the agenda is becoming explicit. This is a proxy war where we avoid the unpopular event of American lives being lost. Post-Vietnam, it has been decreed that America should not get involved in foreign wars that are none of their business, because American families don't like to see their loved ones returning in body bags. The Middle Eastern conflicts, notably Iraq, seemed like an attempt to reboot that foreign policy model, sending American troops to countries that to some degree are none of their business, and certainly wars that are not undertaken for the reasons that were offered at the war's inauguration. This, though, seems like a pretty refined model. No Americans are going to die. American taxpayers are going to pay for it, but Ukrainians are going to do the dying on your behalf, and American opponents are going to be weakened. It still, for me, seems like something that should be subject to democratic process. Whether or not you want to fund ongoing foreign wars is something I'd like a yes-no tick to. Despite the...
Oftentimes what I don't see happen, like I want more people to interview the Ukrainian people. And not the media people, right? Not the people that are a part of Zelensky's, regime there, but just the everyday Ukrainian people on the street, and ask them how they feel about what's happening. And it's unlikely that we'll see that type of footage unless it's an improved narrative that mainstream media wants. But like I said, it's getting to the point now where they have to actually admit that there are some losses here in reference to what's happening with Ukraine. And I just wonder how long mainstream media is going to be able to keep up this facade. You got to think back to when I was younger and the war in Iraq happened. One thing you got to remember, we didn't have social media back then. Boop. There was no Facebook. There was no Twitter, no Snapchat. Is that still a thing? No tickety-tock. None of that. Now you have social media. And especially if you go on TikTok, there are people that are creating these videos and giving people a different perspective in reference to this particular conflict. And that's what I'm saying. That could be part of the reason why more Americans are not happy with the amount of money that's going over there to Ukraine, because social media is showing you a perspective that mainstream media is not telling you. So that's something you got to keep in mind. We did not have social media when September 11 happened, and we did not have social media when the war in Iraq happened. So you got to keep in mind, just think about that.
Lack of success on the battlefield, the Biden administration and most members of Congress want to keep funding the war, which they acknowledge would not continue without US support. So it's a war that would stop if you stopped paying for it. As Zelensky is frank and forthcoming to say, Ukraine could not have survived without America and our allies, Blumenthal said. But his counteroffensive is far from an assured success. In the end, the only way he loses is if America pulls the plug. I don't think anyone's advocating for abandoning Ukraine to the horrors of war, but America could use their considerable might to advance the diplomatic process. Even Donald Trump, in his most cavalier announcement, said, I would say, negotiate now, come to a solution around the disputed ethnic territories, or we're going to arm Ukraine to the teeth ad infinitum. Even that suggests that there is a diplomatic outcome is favoured, that peace should be the prize that all sides are pulling towards. The Washington Post recently reported that US intelligence has determined Ukraine's counteroffensive will fail to meet its main objective of severing Russia's land bridge to Crimea. Despite the conclusion, US is pushing Ukrainian commanders to go harder on the battlefield and complaining that Ukraine has become too casualty averse. Leading up to the counteroffensive, the Discord leaks and other media reports showed the US did not believe Ukraine could regain significant territory. But the Biden administration still pushed for the assault and rejected the idea of a ceasefire. Never mind these hypocritical, corrupt propagandist wars. They're getting on my nerves and they're bringing me down. You know what'll cheer me up? Stickers. Delicious stickers. And
we'll go ahead and pause and stop it there. And one thing I want to add as well was, like, if they really did care about the lives of the Ukrainian people, then they would push for peace. Because the longer the war prolongs, the more people are going to die. And that's just a reality with any war. And it's weird to me that more people don't make that connection, that more people don't understand that, like, how can they say they're fighting for the lives of the Ukrainian people when more Ukrainian people are dying? It was the same way with the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. We see these images of people, whether it's through pictures, whether it's through independent journalists, but so many people are asleep. So many people still really believe, yeah, we got to take down Putin, as if that's the only part of the story. It's just interesting how so many people don't realize that there's two sides to a story when it comes to war and when it comes to our media.